In a quiet suburban neighborhood, nestled behind iron gates and patrolled by golf cart volunteers in neon vests, the illusion of peace was carefully maintained. The homeowners association ruled everything with an iron fist wrapped in flowery newsletters and cheerful block parties. The lawns were measured down to the inch, the mailboxes painted in regulation beige, and even the garden gnomes were subject to committee approval. Beneath this thin veneer of civility, however, resentment simmered. And at the very center of this suburban stage stood Karen. Not just a Karen in the modern sense of the word, but the Karen of the neighborhood. Her hair was a frozen helmet of blonde spray, her lips perpetually pursed, and her voice traveled 3 houses down even in casual conversation. She was the president of the HOA, self-appointed enforcer of bylaws, and self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood standards. For years, families whispered about her excesses, petty fines for leaving trash bins out an extra 10 minutes, scolding children for chalk drawings on sidewalks, harassing dog owners for non-regulation leashes. But no one expected what would happen on that hot September afternoon. The day began like any other. My daughter, Lily, had been playing in the front yard, her laughter carried on the faint hum of cicadas. She was just 6 years old, bright-eyed, endlessly curious, and utterly unbothered by the suffocating rules of the HOA. She had found an old rope in our garage, the kind used for camping trips long before the HOA outlawed fire pits, and she had tied it to a low branch of the massive oak tree that stood on the corner of our yard. To her, it was nothing more than a makeshift swing, a game of pretend. To Karen, it was a crime against property values. Karen had been circling the neighborhood that afternoon, clipboard in hand, searching for her next violation to record. When her eyes fell on my daughter's rope, something seemed to click inside her. She marched across the street, her heels stabbing into the pavement like accusations, her voice rising before she even reached our property line. What followed was not a request, not even a demand, it was a spectacle. In front of neighbors peering through curtains, Karen yanked the rope from Lily's hands. Her words, sharp and cutting, blended with the shrill caws of nearby crows. Lily, confused and frightened, clung to the rope. Karen, fueled by the intoxicating power she always believed she held, looped it back over the branch and tied it high, pulling Lily off her feet in the process. It happened so fast that for a moment the world seemed to stop. My daughter's legs dangled just inches above the ground, her little hands clawing at the rope, her eyes wide in sheer terror. Gasps rippled from doorways and windows, but nobody moved. It was as though the entire neighborhood was paralyzed by the audacity of what they were witnessing. The rope strained, the oak tree groaned, and the afternoon sun beat mercilessly on the scene. My heart seized as I sprinted from the porch, every step feeling too slow, every second stretching like eternity. The image of my child hanging there, helpless, fragile, etched itself into my memory with a cruelty I cannot erase. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the world erupted. The deep, thunderous chop of helicopter blades filled the sky, rattling the windows and shaking loose leaves from the oak. Shadows rolled across the street as 2 military helicopters descended from nowhere, their dark forms blotting out the sun. Neighbors screamed, some dropping to their knees, others scrambling for cover. The carefully maintained illusion of suburban order shattered in an instant under the roar of engines and the whipping gusts of rotor wash. Karen froze, the rope still taut in her manicured hands, her face twisted between confusion and indignation. For the first time, her voice faltered, drowned out by the mechanical storm overhead. I reached Lily, tearing at the knot, pulling her free just as the first helicopter landed directly on the manicured grass of the HOA's beloved community park. Soldiers in tactical gear spilled out, moving with precision and purpose, their boots pounding the earth in unison. The ground shook with every step, and the neighbors who had once cowered under Karen's reign now cowered under something far greater. Children cried, dogs barked, and the hum of suburban life was replaced by the deafening presence of military authority. Karen backed away, her clipboard slipping from her fingers, her once commanding posture shrinking as the soldiers fanned out. For a moment, she tried to muster her usual composure, to wave her arms and declare this an HOA violation of the highest order. But her voice cracked, thin and weak against the roar of the helicopters. And as the dust settled, as the blades slowed just enough for voices to be heard again, it became clear, the neighborhood would never be the same. Because whatever power Karen thought she wielded, whatever control she believed she had, it had just been eclipsed by something she could not fine, regulate, or bully into submission. And in that moment, standing beneath the oak tree with my trembling daughter in my arms, I knew that the story of Karen, and of our neighborhood, was only just beginning. The neighborhood that had always been suffocatingly quiet was now consumed by chaos. The arrival of the helicopters shattered the illusion of order that the HOA prided itself on. For years, Karen had ruled with a manicured fist, her clipboard the symbol of her dominance, but in the swirl of dust and engine roar, all of that authority evaporated. The neatly trimmed hedges, the symmetrical lawns, and the beige mailboxes, all of it seemed absurdly fragile in the face of military boots trampling across driveways. The soldiers fanned out in formation, their gear bristling with radios, weapons, and strange instruments that no one in the neighborhood recognized. They moved with the detached precision of people on a mission, their helmets glinting beneath the harsh sun, their visors reflecting the shocked faces of suburban witnesses. One soldier pointed to the oak tree, while others positioned themselves near the sidewalks, forming a perimeter that transformed the cul-de-sac into a cordoned zone of operations. Karen, who only minutes earlier had believed herself the ultimate authority in this gated community, stood trembling near the base of the tree. Her hands were still red from clutching the rope, her face pale and streaked with sweat. She seemed unable to comprehend the sudden shift in power. For years, she had been the predator, circling her neighbors with fines and threats. But now she looked like prey, cornered under the blades of helicopters and the gaze of armed strangers. The neighbors who had long lived under her tyranny began to emerge from their homes, not boldly, but cautiously, as though testing whether this was safe. Curtains twitched open, garage doors crept upward, and timid steps echoed on driveways. They gathered in clusters, their whispers drowned out by the still churning rotors. Every eye flicked between Karen, the soldiers, and the oak tree that had suddenly become the epicenter of their universe. And then came the moment that solidified the unraveling of Karen's reign. A group of soldiers approached the oak, examining the rope and the branch with a seriousness that seemed almost ritualistic. Their leader, a tall figure with insignia that spoke of rank, gestured sharply. Two soldiers snapped the rope free from the branch, coiling it methodically, as though it were evidence in a crime. Another took photos, his camera clicking in sharp bursts, documenting every angle, every knot, every frayed fiber. The symbolism was not lost on the neighbors. The rope was no longer Karen's instrument of control, it had become evidence of her downfall. Every flash of the camera was like a nail in the coffin of her authority. Karen, however, tried to reassert herself. She puffed up her chest, raised her trembling chin, and pointed to her clipboard as if it were a shield. But the clipboard was just a flimsy piece of plastic, and against the soldiers, it looked ridiculous. Her gestures grew frantic, her voice rising to a pitch that bordered on hysteria. She seemed to be appealing to rules, to bylaws, to the HOA covenant that she had enforced with religious zeal. But rules meant nothing here. The soldiers didn't acknowledge her words, they didn't even glance at her. They moved past her as if she were invisible, a background nuisance in a far greater operation. The crowd of neighbors began to shift. Where once there had been fear of Karen, now there was murmuring excitement, even vindication. People who had been fined for grass that grew half an inch too tall now saw the queen bee stripped of her stinger. Parents who had endured her scoldings for children's laughter after quiet hours, now stood with arms crossed, watching her flounder. And as the helicopters' noise began to fade to a steady hum, a collective realization spread, Karen no longer held the power here. But the soldiers weren't merely here to dismantle her rope and humiliate her. Their presence carried weight far beyond HOA politics. Their movements were too deliberate, their scanning of the area too focused, their equipment too specialized. They weren't responding to a neighborhood squabble, they were executing a mission that none of the residents could fully understand. It soon became apparent that the oak tree was more than just a stage for Karen's cruelty. The soldiers began probing its base, examining the soil, the roots, the very ground itself. Metal detectors swept across the lawn, and handheld scanners emitted strange beeping patterns. Neighbors watched with growing unease. The oak, a fixture of the neighborhood for generations, had always been seen as a landmark, even a meeting point for block parties. But under the scrutiny of military technology, it took on a sinister aura, as though secrets long buried were clawing toward the surface. Karen's protests escalated into wild shrieks, her arms flailing at the soldiers who dared to trespass on what she still believed to be her territory. She shouted at them to stop, to leave the oak alone, to restore her control. But her desperation only made her look smaller, her authority shrinking with every ignored command. The clipboard finally slipped from her hands and fell into the grass, its pages scattering in the rotor wash like pathetic fragments of a broken crown. And then, as if scripted by fate, one of the soldiers uncovered something. At the base of the oak, beneath the neatly manicured mulch, his gloved hand revealed a metallic object half buried in the earth. The crowd gasped collectively, their eyes widening as the object was lifted into the light. It was no ordinary piece of junk. Its surface gleamed unnaturally, its shape unrecognizable, and strange symbols etched into its casing glowed faintly as though reacting to its sudden exposure. The mood shifted instantly. The neighbors, who had come outside to watch a petty tyrant get humbled, now found themselves witnesses to something far larger than war drama. Fear replaced amusement. The soldiers tightened their perimeter, their radios crackling with coded urgency. The helicopters lifted slightly, their engines straining, as if preparing for immediate evacuation or reinforcement. Karen collapsed to her knees near the oak, her face contorted in disbelief. For the first time, it became clear that her obsession with control wasn't just about rules or appearances. It was about that tree. About what lay beneath it. About secrets she had tried to guard under the disguise of bylaws and regulations. The rope had been an excuse, a distraction. Her war on swings, ropes, and play had always been about keeping people away from that oak. And now, in front of the entire neighborhood, that secret was no longer hers to keep. The soldiers surrounded the object, carefully lifting it into a reinforced case that hummed faintly when closed. The glow disappeared, but the unease it left behind lingered. The neighbors' eyes darted between each other, silently asking questions none dared to voice. The military hadn't come for Karen. They had come for the oak. And now that its secret was uncovered, none of them, not even Karen herself, knew what would happen next. The neighborhood, once suffocated by the petty tyranny of war politics, now found itself under the shadow of something incomprehensible, something vast, something terrifying. And as the helicopters prepared to lift off again, carrying the strange object with them, one thing became clear: this was not the end of Karen's story. It was only the beginning of something much darker. The neighborhood that once measured its pride in lawn heights and WA newsletters was now gripped by something far heavier. As the helicopters throbbed above and soldiers loaded the glowing artifact into its armored case, the truth began to settle over the cul-de-sac like a storm cloud. What had once seemed like a petty skirmish between an overzealous WA president and a young family had unraveled into something that none of the residents were prepared for. The artifact was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Its surface shifted as though alive, its glow pulsing faintly even through the reinforced case. When it had been lifted from the earth beneath the oak tree, the air itself had seemed to change. Birds that had been perched on rooftops scattered into the distance. Dogs fell silent. Even the cicadas seemed to stop their endless hum. It was as though nature itself recoiled from the thing that had been unearthed. The neighbors could only watch in stunned silence as the soldiers carried it with ritualistic care, every movement precise, as if one wrong step might trigger something catastrophic. Radios crackled constantly, voices urgent but controlled, their words drowned by the helicopter's roar. The soldiers were not improvising. They had known exactly what to expect. And that meant only one thing: Karen had known, too. She knelt in the grass near the oak, her hair disheveled, her once perfect appearance unraveling. She stared at the artifact as though watching her life's purpose being stolen from her. The clipboard that had once been her weapon of control lay abandoned at her side, its papers scattered like dead leaves. For years she had disguised her obsession as rigid enforcement of war rules. The swings she banned, the climbing children she scolded, the endless insistence that no one approach the oak, it all made sense now. She had not been guarding property values. She had been guarding a secret buried in the soil. But secrets do not stay buried forever. The neighbors, once united in their resentment of her, now stood torn between fear and curiosity. They looked at the soldiers, at Karen, at each other, their minds racing with the weight of what this revelation meant. If something so strange and dangerous had been beneath their feet all along, what else might have been? Hidden in their manicured world, what other truths had been wrapped in the suffocating folds of WA bylaws and regulations? The helicopters prepared to lift, their engines revving higher, the soldiers tightening their grips on weapons as if anticipating resistance. Dust swirled, leaves tore from trees, and the very foundations of the neighborhood seemed to shake. And then it happened. The artifact, sealed inside its armored case, pulsed violently. A light bled through the seams of the container, brighter and brighter until the glow seared against the soldiers' visors. The case vibrated, a low hum building into a sound that resonated deep in every chest. Children clutched their parents' legs, dogs howled, and windows rattled as though in the throes of an earthquake. Karen screamed, not in anger this time, but in terror. She reached toward the artifact as if begging it to stop, as if her plea could soothe whatever force had been disturbed. But her cries were drowned out as the light exploded outward. For a brief, blinding moment, the cul-de-sac was no longer a quiet suburban street. The houses, the lawns, the mailboxes, all were bathed in an otherworldly brilliance that seemed to strip away the facade of normal life. In that instant, every neighbor saw flashes of something vast, something incomprehensible. Images seared into their minds, structures rising into the sky, landscapes not of this earth, and symbols etched into their vision that no human language could contain. And then, as suddenly as it began, the light vanished. The artifact went dark, the case settled, the hum subsided, but the neighborhood was forever changed. The soldiers wasted no time. They sealed the container tighter, barking commands into radios, their urgency now sharpened into outright alarm. Reinforcements were already on their way. More helicopters could be heard in the distance, their blades chopping the sky like advancing drums of war. The neighbors staggered in stunned silence, their minds reeling from what they had just witnessed. The perfect rows of houses no longer looked like symbols of security. They looked fragile, temporary, insignificant compared to the secret they had been built around. Karen, still on her knees, wept. All the years of control, all the fines and the petty power plays, had been her attempt to manage the unmanageable. She had not been protecting property values, she had been trying, in her own twisted way, to protect the neighborhood from the truth buried beneath its roots. But now, with the military fully in control, even that illusion of guardianship was stripped from her. She was not the queen of the HOA. She was just another powerless resident, left broken in the dust. The soldiers moved with renewed urgency, loading into helicopters, securing the perimeter tighter, preparing to vanish with the artifact before the neighborhood could even process what had unfolded. And then they were gone. The roar of the engines faded into the distance, leaving behind only silence, broken fences, uprooted grass, and a community that would never return to normal. The oak tree stood stripped of its secret, its branches swaying weakly in the breeze, as though relieved of a burden it had carried for generations. The rope that had once nearly claimed a child's life lay torn in the dirt, a relic of the moment that had shattered everything. The neighbors drifted back to their homes, not with the quiet routine of suburban evenings, but with haunted eyes and uncertain steps. They had seen too much to ever return to gossiping about lawn heights and mailbox paint. Their world had expanded, violently and unwillingly, beyond property lines and HOA covenants. And at the center of it all, Karen remained on her knees, staring at the empty patch of earth where the artifact had been pulled from the soil. She had lost everything, her power, her secret, her reputation. She was no longer feared. She was no longer respected. She was simply broken, a reminder of the danger of guarding secrets too large to control. The sun set slowly, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. The cicadas returned, their hum indifferent to the cataclysm that had unfolded. Life would continue, but never the same. Because once you have seen the truth, you cannot unsee it. And though the helicopters had vanished, though the soldiers had carried away the artifact, its echo lingered in every crack of the pavement, in every whisper of the wind through the oak tree's leaves. The neighborhood had thought its greatest danger was an overzealous